census. I was a supervisor. I didn't go out in the field, but I helped recruit and train. And my boss at that time was Bob Maloney. Bob was a P-51 pilot from World War II over Germany, a top-notch guy. I'm sure Bob is gone now, but he and I became partners in the field because he liked to hunt. And we reduced the elk herd a little bit up there. We didn't hurt it any, but that was a wonderful time of my life. That was right after we were married.
Well, that was the time also when Mann Gulch happened. Were you in Helena then, or up at Choteau?
No, I was in Choteau.
What do you remember about that?
I sure do. Jackie will tell you, my wife can tell you the same thing. We were traveling from Helena, or from Choteau to Helena. Went off into the distance to the east was this enormous cloud of smoke. And I said, there's a hot one going on. I said, I don't think that'll be a jumper site because it's close enough to people and so on. When she said, well, I sure hope not. And when we got to Helena, we realized that it had been a jumper fire, and it was not manageable. But at that time, they didn't know it was as serious as it was. Well, no. When it became known that there was fatalities out there, I couldn't go, of course. I had no business out there, so I didn't even try to go. But Howard Retz run the funeral parlor in Helena. He brought the jumpers that had perished back to Helena. And he let me sit there. Just for a moment. And remember the good times we had. I don't like to go back there very often. It shouldn't have happened if I can believe what I read. I can't even remember the crew chief's name.
Wag Dodge.
Yeah, who had said, get the backfires going and stay put. And apparently they were so close to the Goat Rock they thought they could make it. And of course they didn't. The one that did make it made national news. Reed, what's his name? Yeah, he was a spokesperson for the Forest Service for that fire. But I always be an advocate of the Forest Service, and would never say anything pro or con against them either. But I always remember telling Jackie, that isn't a hot spot. It's a lot of smoke, but it's close enough for ground pounders to get to, which didn't happen. So today we have those were our children when they were young. One turned out to be an engineer. The other one is a professional psychologist with her own office, and the third one is working in Missoula in the television business. And they've all produced children who are now in college, who are now giving us great-grandchildren. And I'm still saying, yes, dear. So everything's hunky-dory.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that you worked up at the Whitetail Ranch. When did you do that?
Oh, I did that while I was still working at the telephone company. That had to be in the late 30s and early 40s. Harry Joslin, you know Joslin's store.
Yeah, so you worked there before you were a jumper?
Oh yes, yeah. That's oh yeah. I learned a lot from that kind of work to be a jumper. I felt qualified because we would back, travel, unload. We had to babysit these guys from the East Coast, and I don't say that in any derogatory sense of the word. But if we didn't know what we were doing, we'd be in bad shape. And Tom Edwards knew it, so he had that much faith in us to take the guys out.
So what would you do? You put a pack string together, and what did the work consist of?
Well, Tom would winter his horses over in the Bitterroot Valley. In the spring, he'd bring them back, and he'd start training them for packing. When he had them ready to go, then he started taking tourists and dudes back into the Bob Marshall on fishing trips, or if not fishing trips, just to look-see trips, because they would go where they certainly couldn't have gone on foot. And he was quite successful on it. When fall came along, he was first in line to get outfitter licensing to go back into the Cooney Creek country. The Cooney Creek cabin was built years and years ago by the early sheep ranchers that came in from Spain, and they would run sheep back in that Cooney Creek country. And they did for years until they decided that the grizzlies were eating more sheep than they could bring out of the country. And that's not a joke, because they left. But today there are still swaths up through the tall timber where you can see that there's been a swath cut. Not burned, but cut. And that would be the pathway that the early day sheep people, and it was about 22 miles from the Whitetail Ranch to the Cooney Creek cabin where we stayed.
So you were getting that experience before. You didn't work for the Forest Service, you worked for a dude ranch before.
I worked for a dude rancher.
Yeah. Did you ever see any smoke jumpers go overhead when you were out in the boonies?
No. One of the later jumpers has an outfit going right now today, and I can't think of his name, and that's terrible. Because my kids took me back into the Bob Marshall as a senior citizens one day, and he packed us in, and damn, I can't remember his name. But I know, I think I was the first, at least in this area. I don't know of any others.
So when you finished with the Census Bureau, you're in the early 50s, so what did you do since then?
Well, when the 50 census was over, I wasn't demoted, but I was downgraded from a census supervisor to the clerk. And I said, no, wait, time. I said, I think I can do better than this, and I quit and went to Helena and finagled a job with the telephone company. And they sent me back to Great Falls as a salesman. And that's where my education of people relationship began, is with the telephone company. That was 1950 is when I went to work for the telephone company. Here's the boss here.
Oh, am I interrupted? I'm gonna run some errands.
So you're with the phone company in Great Falls and learning people skills, and
Well, I worked there for 2 years, and they sent me back to Helena to work in that office with Don Satterthwaite, who was a manager of the local office. That was at my request. And I worked, this is where my firstborn was delivered. John was born in Helena, 1951. And we worked here until 53, and they sent me back to Great Falls again, where I stayed as a sales engineer for, let me see, two or three years. And then they needed a sales engineer, they called him, over to Butte. And my time in Butte includes those trips I described to you earlier about setting up rural lines to the south in the Lima country. And I stayed there until 1958, 58, yeah, when they sent me back to Helena as the state sales engineer trainer, which was another job. And I traveled the state there, as well as being a salesman. I trained as best you can a non-salesperson to become a salesperson, and the clerks we had to have in the offices needed training, and that was my job as well as taking. I had several big jobs that I took over, but that's a horse of a different story. In those days, the fastest communications in the world was an 8-speed ASNR, automatic send and receive teletypewriter. And I was given the task of taking a send and receive machine up to the Montana Sheriff's Association office in Glasgow and implant this concept to the law enforcement community about how important it is to communicate between you and have the printed word in front of you. Well, hell, that's like shooting ducks in a row. I went up and they says, we want it. Well, that was the biggest step that Montana had ever had. And then, well, there was a couple more times, but that's unimportant.